Patricia M. Sias is a professor in the Edward R. Murrow School of Communication at Washington State University. She is the author of more than 25 peer-reviewed research articles and book chapters. Dr. Sias received her PhD from the University of Texas at Austin in 1993, where she was awarded the W. Charles Redding Outstanding Dissertation Award for the Outstanding Doctoral Dissertation in Organizational Communication, sponsored by the International Communication Association. Since 1993, Dr. Sias has spent the bulk of her time researching interpersonal relationships in organizations. In 2009, Dr. Sias published Organizing Relationships, Traditional and Emerging Perspectives on Workplace Relationships with Sage Publications. Let's welcome Dr. Patricia Sias to CommuniCast. Recently, you published Organizing Relationships, Traditional and Emerging Perspectives on Workplace Relationships by Sage Publications. What made you initially interested in studying workplace relationships?
Well, there was two reasons. I would say one's personal and the other is more academic. The personal one is that in all the jobs I've had over the many, many years I've been working, relationships have always been really important to me. I always, got along with my coworkers, had friendships with them. For a while I was a personnel manager, and so I learned a lot about the supervisor-subordinate kind of dynamics. And so they always seemed to me to be the center of organizational communication. It occurs in the context of workplace relationships. So it just was always a very important part of my life. Then when I was a doctoral student at University of Texas, I studied with Fred Jablin, and so I learned a lot about supervisor-subordinate relationships because he was an expert in that. But I was amazed, this was back in the late 80s, early 90s, that there was very little, almost nothing, on other types of relationships in the workplace, particularly peer and coworker relationships. And I thought, given that we have many more peers than we have supervisors, that's where most of our org-com takes place. And so I was kind of perplexed by that and thought that would be really interesting and important and the void that I wanted to fill. And so that was the academic part. And in doing so, I became really interested in workplace friendships, which is probably my primary area of research, mainly because of their voluntary nature. And we don't really choose our coworkers, we don't really choose our boss, and typically, but we do choose which of them we become friends with. And so I became really interested in wanting to understand why and how we choose to become friends with some coworkers and not others, and the consequences of that, and looking at how and why friendships deteriorate as well. So that's sort of how I got interested.
Within your text, you mentioned that the bulk of research on workplace relationships has been guided by a post-positivist perspective. What is a post-positivist perspective on workplace relationships?
It's essentially a social scientific approach, and I'd say it's not only the bulk of research on workplace relationships, but on org-com in general has been a post-positive kind of approach. And that's basically an approach that's directed toward prediction and control, very strongly rooted in the scientific method. So it assumes things like there is a reality, and the reality is indicated by observable kind of phenomena such as communication and other, behavior. And this is in contrast to, say, a social construction approach, which says reality is constituted in interaction and communication. So a post-positive perspective on workplace relationship has the goal of obtaining knowledge regarding different factors that impact or can predict various types of workplace relationships and the quality of various types of workplace relationships. And that research also seeks to develop knowledge regarding how various types of workplace relationships predict outcomes. So, for example, how do supervisor-subordinate relationship quality predict employee satisfaction, employee commitment, turnover, productivity, and the like? Does that make sense?
So how then does a post-positivistic perspective alter how you view organizations and workplace relationships?
Well, I think one of the main, most important, consequences, and I use the term consequence in a neutral way, not negative or positive, just something that happens if you consider workplace relationships from a post-positive perspective. I think one of the most important consequences is that it separates relationships and organizations. In other words, organizations from this perspective are things, inside which people behave and inside of which relationships exist, right? So they're actually separate. And again, this would be in contrast to a social construction or a constitutive perspective, which conceptualizes organizations not as separate from the members, but as constituted by the members. So the members themselves are the organizations, and in particular, the relationships among the members constitute the organization, and the way they communicate with each other constitutes the organization.
That pretty much is the first part of what you say in your title, which is the traditional perspectives.
Right.
What are the emerging perspectives?
The emerging perspectives, the ones that I cover in the book, are the social construction, critical approaches, and structuration theory.
Okay, and how do those influence how we view workplace relationships?
Well, the social construction one really constitutes or conceptualizes organizations as constitute. It exists in the interaction of the members, right? So wherever members are interacting to accomplish the goals of the organization, that's where the organization is, right? So it focuses a lot more on organizing than organizations. With respect to workplace relationships, then, from a social construction perspective, relationships don't exist outside of the members of the relationship and exist in their interaction. So the quality of a relationship really is indicated or determined, now I don't like to use that word determined, indicated by the quality of the interaction of those members. So if you're going to do a social construction type of study of a workplace relationship, you would be interested in questions like, how do people develop relationships? What communication characteristics differentiate different types of relationships? How do the relationship members accomplish deterioration of the relationship or distancing through their communication? So kind of process-oriented types of questions. Critical approach asks a very different set of questions. It's kind of rooted also in the social construction, this notion that relationships are constituted by communication, but it also is, you'll be looking at issues, questions of power and dominance and marginalization. So, for example, you might look at what kind of communication patterns do supervisors use to express, or enact dominance over employees. How do employees communicatively resist dominance by supervisors or others? I think, a real interesting area of research is starting and should really be pursued, looking at how an employee's access or lack of access to informal social groups like informal friendship networks impacts things like the glass ceiling, the inability to progress in their career, and those sorts of things. So really looking at how communication within the context of relationships and the relationships themselves empower and disempower various employees. And then there's the structuration approach, which it's a relatively complex theory. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but basically explains how things that we take for granted, various social structures that we take for granted, develop over time and across contexts. So, we all behave in particular ways, guided by a variety of what Giddens would call structures that enable us to behave in particular ways. And, I understand how to behave in this interview, for example, right? Mm-hmm. And I understand what I shouldn't be doing in an interview such as this because of these structures that I've developed over time about appropriate interview behavior. And so, but I didn't create that structure. It's been something that's been developed in our society over many, many decades and across many, many contexts. So structuration kinds of questions about workplace relationships would ask questions like, how do we know sort of we all have ideas and structures that guide our interaction with our supervisor, for example, but where do those come from? How did they develop? How have they changed over time? And how do these structures sort of transport across contexts? So, for example, as we're moving to a more and more global economy, global workforce, are we seeing, and I think we are, seeing more and more Western sorts of notions of supervisor-subordinate relationship behavior in other parts of the world? How does that happen? that kind of very different sets of questions about the same types of relationships.
Now, within your text, you group your chapters by 5 types of workplace relationships: subordinate supervisor, peer coworker, friendship romantic, and customer client. What made you decide on these 5 specific contexts?
Well, I actually gave a lot of thought about that and about what do I include, what shouldn't I include. And my main goal is I wanted to be comprehensive because I've taught various courses on workplace relationships over the years, and there's never been like a comprehensive book that covers all types, the primary types. And so you sort of pick and choose a chapter from here, a chapter from another book, some articles, and that sort of thing. So I wanted a comprehensive book that really covers the primary types of workplace relationships that people engage in when they do their work. And of course, those were the types that were most often researched also. But the original proposal, I didn't include a chapter on the customer-client relationships. And I think that's probably because of my focus, which is really on internal organizational dynamics. And also, I think the field of org-com tends toward more internal kinds of questions. But as I was kind of working through the literature and reading, I really became convinced that I couldn't leave this type of relationship out, the customer and the client. And so it wasn't an area of expertise for me. So actually, because of that, I think I found writing that chapter to be among the most interesting and enjoyable because I learned so much from it. And it exposed me to a really interesting research that I hadn't typically read before. So that was sort of added on after the original proposal went through, and my editor agreed that would be a good thing to add. So I think we kind of touched really pretty comprehensive. I think we addressed pretty much most types of relationships. I can't think of another primary type that was left out in the book.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the bulk of your research has been on friendships relationships.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you've learned over the years?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I've learned a lot about them, mainly about sort of how this notion that friendships are voluntary is true to an extent, but the context itself can be arranged in such a way that I'm not sure it's completely voluntary. In other words, for example, one of the main things that I found over and over again that tends to be important in people initiating friendships, who am I going to become friends with, is who they're near, physically near. Who do they, if your desk is next to someone, right? That's going to be a big predictor of whether or not you're going to become friends with that person, as opposed to someone who's in a completely different building, right? Or maybe you're working with someone on a particular project. Basically, any opportunity, the more opportunities people have to communicate with one another, the more likely it seems they're going to probably develop friendships with one another. And so this notion of communication, I really do take a kind of social construction approach to relationships. And that's, sorry about my phone there. I really do take a social construction approach to friendships, and that's become clear in my research. But another thing I think that's been really interesting to me is, we tend to have very positive understanding about friendships. Friendship is a good thing, and it's good for people to have friends at work and that sort of thing. And that is true, but some of my research has shown that really, really close friendships can actually be kind of dysfunctional. I've talked to a lot of people over the years in various studies I've done who are in horrible situations, miserable work environments, just a terrible place to be, but they stayed because they didn't want to leave their friends. So these friendships can they're certainly related to commitment, but not always in highly functional ways. And so I've become more interested in looking at sort of the dysfunctional elements of friendships and deterioration. What are the problems that people experience when they're friends with a coworker, and how do you manage things like, if you don't want to be friends with a person anymore, but you've got to, spend the bulk of your waking hours sitting next to them. How do people manage that in a way that allows them to still be productive and, enjoy their work while having to be next to a person they no longer like? So those would be probably the main things that I've found interesting.
Now, your last chapter examines workplace relationships with regards to society. What have you learned about the place of workplace relationships within society?
Well, first of all, that there are no clear boundaries between work and and society. That at the workplace is actually an incredibly important part of society. And workplace relationships are therefore incredibly important social entities. As I mentioned in my book, we probably, for most people in a typical, full-time job, we spend probably more of our waking hours with our coworkers than we do with our family and friends, right? So these relationships are just so important to people. And so the more functional and the more rewarding they can be for employees, the better it is for them, not just as employees and not just for the organization, but for their life, right? For their happiness as a human being. And so that chapter talks about some kind of interesting new, relatively new directions in our research that is acknowledging this. One is this notion of work-family balance and, how do people work out things like, being with their family and managing family issues and also doing their jobs. And one of the things that research shows is that the quality of the relationships they have with their coworkers is very important in that. If your child is sick and you need to go home, if you have a good friend at work who can cover for you, that helps a lot, So a lot of really interesting research going on in that area. And then another pretty new area that's related to this is this notion of spirituality in the workplace. And so that chapter talks a lot about this notion that with the new social contract, I guess it's not so new anymore, where people are less committed to organizations and organizations less committed to employees and so forth. People are looking for meaning in other ways and trying to derive meaning from their work by focusing on things like, and when I say spirituality, it's not really a religious concept, right? It's more about getting meaning from your work, getting meaning from your work life, forming really close, caring relationships with people at work so that it is as rewarding as it can be in a more spiritual, emotional way rather than simply productivity and performance. So those two issues really are the bulk of that chapter. Also, I talk a lot in that chapter about technology, and the technological advances we're making in society clearly are impacting the workplace in a variety of ways, not the least of which is increasing globalization and global workforces and virtual workforces, and that has a lot of consequences for relationships as well.
Now, where do you believe the study of workplace relationships needs to head in the future?
Well, I think what we need to do, and this is really probably the main thrust of the whole book, and my main goal, is we need to be studying all these various types of workplace relationships from all these different and diverse theoretical approaches, right? If you only look at a relationship, study relationships from a post-positive perspective, right, you miss out on all the things, all the types of knowledge that can be gained from understanding the social and communicative processes that constitute those relationships. And you ignore all the, various very important consequences of power and marginalization and disempowerment that occur through these relationships. And of course, without looking at it from a structuration perspective, we don't really understand where these prototypes and structures that enable relationships, where they originated and how they change over time. So at the end of each chapter, what I do is I actually provide a research agenda for the future listing, it's in a table listing a bunch of research questions and ideas for studying each of that particular type of relationship covered in the chapter from each of those alternative perspectives that I talked about. And so in a way, the book is a book of research ideas and a research to-do list. And my hope is that people actually carry out these studies that I suggest in there, and then we'll really have a much richer and much deeper understanding of workplace relationships than we currently do. So that's what I'd love to see. I'd love to just open a book and be able to read an article that looks at workplace friendships from a critical perspective. Like, oh, that would be awesome, and see that one of my research ideas actually carried out would be great.
How do you think the new influx of social networking, especially the computer technologies and social networking, are changing how workplace relationships are functioning today?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't know. And I think that's something that really does need to be studied, and it would be really fascinating to do. I don't have a Facebook page myself. My daughters do. I have two teenage daughters, so I look on theirs quite a bit, and I kind of have an understanding of how all that works. I guess at one level, I would say it might possibly make our workplace friendships more broad but less deep. In other words, what I hear people saying is, "Oh, I have this many friends. How many do you have?" And the more the better kind of thing. But my understanding is that those, Facebook type friendships are pretty superficial. They're sort of, if someone clicks on there and accepts you as a friend, they're your friend, right? Which is not the type of the sort of deep friendships that we're talking about with very close kinds of friendships. So I'm not sure. I think in some ways it's changing the very definition of what a friend is. And I'm not sure, of the positive, negative, neutral, whatever outcomes of that. But I think it's a really interesting kind of important area. I know a lot of businesses actually have Facebook pages now. Our college does. The college I'm in has a Facebook page. It's becoming more and more prevalent in the workplace. But I think that would be a really fascinating dissertation for someone to do.
We have been talking to Patricia Sias about her new book, Organizing Relationships, Traditional and Emerging Perspectives on Workplace Relationships by Sage Publications. Thank you, Dr. Sias, for joining us today on CommuniCast.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it. Enjoyed it.
CommuniCast is a production of the Communication and Media Department at SUNY